Welcome back to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology, in this section on the cardiovascular system. The function of the cardiovascular system is the movement of blood and nutrients, or oxygen and nutrients, around the body. Every cell in our body has certain needs. It has to get oxygen, which allows it to produce the energy that it needs. It also needs the nutrients and fluids in order to survive, and it also has to get rid of waste. If you're a single-celled organism, you don't need a circulatory system because you're able to do all those functions, get oxygen from the surroundings, excrete waste into the surroundings, and get the nutrients and the exchanges you need all by yourself. But as a multicellular-celled organism, we have to have, every cell in our body has to have contact with this nourishing replacement of oxygen and getting rid of waste and things like that. And that's what our circulatory system is doing constantly. If our circulatory system shuts down, it's only a matter of minutes before our cells start dying and shutting down as well. And the reason that's happening is because they're not getting this oxygen, this replenishment of oxygen and other things, the food and things that they need to continue living. And so it's a very important system. And one of the interesting things to look at is how the oxygen is related, because that's one of the things that the blood is taking around. When we think about blood, we think about oxygen-rich blood, oxygen-poor blood. In the last part of this lecture, we talked about the parts of the heart, and we looked at the right and left atria and the right and left ventricles. In this slide here, I just want to point out the oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor blood. The blood in the right side of the heart, as it's coming in from the body, is oxygen poor. So it's already been out to all the cells in the body. They've already taken all that oxygen from the blood, and so the blood returning in the vena cava is oxygen poor blood. The right ventricle then pumps this blood to the lungs, where it's going to pick up oxygen and then become very oxygen rich blood, and then return to the left side of the heart. And then from the left side, this oxygen rich blood is then pumped clear around the body, and then from there it comes back. So the heart itself is actually two pumps in one. So we have one pump that is going on what we call the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary, talking about the lungs. So the right side of the heart is pumping the blood to the lungs and back. Then the left side is what we call the systemic circuit, or the systemic circulation. So the left side is pumping the blood to the body. So we have two pumps in one. One to the lungs, pulmonary, one to the body, called the systemic. Notice here as well, and we'll talk about blood vessels a little bit later, but in general, arteries, which are always coming away from the heart, so arteries are blood vessels leaving the heart, are oxygen rich. So notice the aorta and all the arteries associated with it are going to be oxygen rich. Veins, including the vena cava, which is emptying into the heart, are oxygen poor in the systemic circuit. However, in the pulmonary circuit, it's a little bit different, because the pulmonary arteries are leaving the heart to go to the lungs. But they're called arteries because they're leaving, but notice that there's oxygen poor blood in these arteries. So to say in general that all arteries have oxygen rich blood would be incorrect because of the pulmonary circuit. So there are a couple in general it is okay, but there are a couple exceptions, and this is one of them. And so the pulmonary veins, which are coming back to the heart, are carrying oxygen rich blood. I also want to point out one other thing, and that is that the heart, even though it's full of this blood, and in the case of the left side it's full of oxygen rich blood, the heart itself is not nourished, does not get the oxygen directly from the blood inside the ventricles, inside the parts of the blood. So it has to have vessels going to the heart as well. So it has its own little circulatory system. And you see the circulatory system coming off almost immediately after the blood leaves the heart. And we call these the coronary arteries. So these coronary arteries are coming off of the aorta, and they're branching out and feeding the myocardium so that it has all the oxygen it needs. And as you can imagine, the heart does need a lot of oxygen in order for these muscle cells to keep pumping as much as they do. And also it's the first place it gets oxygen, first place it gets nourished directly after the heart, after that blood leaves the heart. The brain is another important part, another important organ of the body that needs a lot of nourishment, and the blood heads there, but not until after it's fed the heart itself. Then we have the cardiac veins, and they're bringing that blood back and dumping it back into the heart through the coronary sinus, which is a large vein on the heart that's gathering all that blood from the cardiac veins and dumping it back into the right atrium. So it doesn't go into the vena cava, it dumps directly into the right atrium of the heart. And if you look at a picture of the heart here, you can see those veins and those arteries coming off. So here you can see the coronary arteries coming down around the heart, nourishing that whole heart, and then you have the coronary veins coming here, and then they're going to dump into the coronary sinus, and then dump back into the right atrium over here, and this will continue. Interesting thing here, though, is that notice these veins and arteries are located on the ventricles. As these ventricles are contracting, that closes off these vessels. So every time your heart pumps, blood can't go into these arteries until the ventricles relax. And so the heart gets fed during the relaxation phase. And this is fine, it works fine, except that as you start to exercise, your heart is going to pump faster, but the length of time it takes for your heart to pump remains fairly constant. But what happens is the relaxation phase space between each contraction is going to become shorter and shorter as your heart is pumping faster and faster, which means that you have less and less time to get blood to the heart. And in a healthy person, that's not actually a problem. Your heart is able to get all the blood it needs during that very short relaxation period, or it's able to get all the oxygen it needs from the blood in that short relaxation period. But if there's anything closing off these arteries, such as atherosclerosis caused by a plaque, or something like that. If there's anything blocking off these vessels, then it's going to be harder for your heart to get the blood that it needs, the oxygen that it needs, and that can lead again to a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. Next, we want to talk a little bit about how the heart is able to contract. So we have the atria, and we have the ventricles. And the atria, again, they contract at the same time. The ventricles also contract at the same time. And so all these heart muscles need some sort of system that'll tell them when to contract so they can contract all together. If you have your heart muscles contracting at different times, that's a problem. Your heart's not going to be able to work correctly. An interesting thing about the heart muscles themselves, they want to contract. So what this means is if you were to take your heart and cut it up into individual cells and separate all of them, each of them would pump. They just naturally pump. And they'd pump at different rates. In fact, the atrial cells would pump a little bit faster, the ventricles would pump a little bit slower, and then each one would have its own rhythm. But when you take these cells and you put them together, they're going to start following the strongest beats. So they're able to coordinate their beats according to some sort of signal that's being given. So that's what's going on in our heart here. So all of these heart muscles naturally want to contract, and as long as we have some sort of signal, some sort of strong beat for them to follow, they'll all follow in suit. If we don't have a beat, then they're all going to kind of do their own thing, and it's not going to work correctly. And so our heart has something called it's a natural pacemaker. And we're familiar, I'm sure you've heard of older people that have had to have an artificial pacemaker. And what that artificial pacemaker is doing is it's replacing the natural pacemaker that their heart has that is no longer functioning correctly. And so it's providing this signal for the heart to follow. So we're going to look at how the heartbeat, the pacemaker is set up and how this works here. This is similar to the nervous system. This is an electrical system that's happening in the heart, but these are not nervous tissue cells. These are not neurons that are causing this to happen. These are modified cardiac muscle cells that are carrying this out, even though they have a very similar function. So there's a couple places that become very important. There's what's called the Sinoatrial Node, and this is the pacemaker of the body. It's located in the right atrium, and it sets the pace for the atrial contraction and also is going to affect the ventricles as well. So what happens is this sinoatrial node, or the SA node, sends out a signal. And because all the heart muscles are connected to each other, this signal spreads and the muscles contract. So notice how the signal is leaving the SA node and it's fanning out through the atria. It's also going to the left atrium as well. And so as this happens, the muscle cells are going to depolarize and they're going to contract. This is going to signal them to all contract at the same time. So both the left and right atria contract at the same time. As this signal moves out, it's going to reach something called the Atrioventricular Node, or the AV node, which is located in the tissue between the atrium and the ventricle on the right side. This signal, when it reaches the AV node, that's going to trigger the AV node to send out a signal as well. But there's a slight delay that happens here. So when the AV node is signaled, it's going to wait just a fraction of a second in order to allow the atrium to relax so that we don't have the atrium and the ventricle pumping at the same time. So we have a split second wait here, and then it sends out a signal. But notice this, so the atria, because we're trying to pump the blood, and let me maybe draw it in blue here so you can see, we're trying to pump the blood this direction from the atria. And so that means that we want the contraction of the heart muscles to also move in that direction. So the SA node is at the top, and as the signal is sent out, the contraction is going to start at the top and move in this direction to pump the blood into the ventricle. But in the case of the ventricles, we now want the blood to go this way. So we want the contraction to start down here and move up in the ventricles. In order for that to happen, the signal has to start down here as opposed to up here. So in the AV, when the AV node sends a signal, there's a very fast pathway where this signal heads all the way down to the bottom of the ventricles. We call this the bundle of His. So this is a bundle of fibers that send the signal all the way down to the bottom of the ventricle without causing any muscle contraction to happen here. Then at that point, we're going to move up what are called the Purkinje Fibers. And as the signal moves up these Purkinje fibers, that's going to cause the left ventricle and the right ventricle to contract at the same time, pushing the blood in the direction we want it to move. So what's going to happen is the contraction is going to start here down at the bottom and move upward as it continues on. So using this method, the contraction will begin at the apex and move up, forcing the blood into the vessels and out through the body. And this pacemaker here, this SA node, is going to set a pace of about 75 beats per minute. That's pretty average between all adults. Sometimes some people's heartbeat may be slower, some people may be faster. So an athlete, especially if you're in really good shape, your heartbeat's often going to be a lot lower than that 75 beats per minute. But people can naturally have a higher or lower heartbeat. We call this tachycardia if it's over 100 beats per minute, and bradycardia if it's below 60 beats per minute. Neither one is necessarily dangerous, but if you have a fast heartbeat over a long period of time, that can eventually lead to problems, heart failure, fatigue of the heart, and things like that. So it may cause problems, but initially there's not really any problem, and every day as we're moving and doing different activities, our heartbeat may go up and down a number of times throughout the day. If the heart does not have the pacemaker, if it's not working correctly or something's going wrong, then what happens is something we call fibrillation, which is when the heart muscle cells are basically not working together, and so they're all kind of contracting at their own pace, and your heart is no longer functioning as a pump, so it's not able to pump the blood because it's not working in a coordinated fashion. But you've probably seen, or may have you learned to use what's called a defibrillator, which is a machine that basically resets the heart. It gives the heart a little shock and gets everything back on course, everything pumping together again. If your pacemaker isn't working, your SA node is damaged for some reason, then that's when you're going to get an artificial pacemaker. The last part of this lecture here, let's talk a little bit about what's called the cardiac cycle. And we're going to talk more about blood pressure and how to measure blood pressure later in this section as well. Not necessarily this lecture, but later in this lecture series about the cardiovascular system. And this is a good time to point out a couple words you'll see again, and one is called diastole, and the other one is called systole, which we'll see here in a minute, and I'll point that out when it comes. You may have also heard this. You may have also heard this called diastolic pressure or systolic pressure. Basically, what's happening in diastole is heart relaxation. Systole is heart contraction. And so in our cardiac cycle, what we have is this cycling, this trade-off between contraction, systolic pressure, and diastolic pressure. And when you're taking someone's blood pressure, that's what you're measuring, is the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. The amount of pressure in the blood vessel in the artery when your heart is contracting, and then when it's not, when it's resting, the diastolic pressure. So, what's going on here is we have a moment in time when the whole heart is relaxed. There's nothing. The atria are not contracting. The ventricles are not contracting either. And this is when the blood is passively filling the ventricles, moving through the atria and moving into the ventricles. And we call this mid to late diastole, which is ventricular filling. And then towards late diastole, then we're going to have the atria contracting. When we talk about the cardiac cycle and the diastole and systole, we're always talking about the ventricles. So notice here that the atria are contracting, which would be, so we're just going to focus on the ventricles. So even though the atria are relaxing, contracting, we're just looking at the ventricles. So this is late diastole. And now we're moving into ventricular systole. So we have ventricular systole, meaning that it is now contracting. Notice that the atria are in diastole right now, but we're going to call this systole because we're looking at the ventricles. So as they begin to contract, the pressure is rising. Haven't yet opened the semilunar valves, but then the semilunar valves are going to open, and we're going to have total systole as the blood is moving out to the body. And then we're going to move back into the relaxation phase. So the ventricles have contracted, they've ejected all the blood, they've moved back to this relaxation stage, and the atria are also relaxed at this point. So this is early diastole, we then move to mid to late diastole, ventricular systole, and it continues on and on and on. This is called the cardiac cycle and how the blood is pumped around the body. Alright, that's it for this section. In the next section we'll look at some cardiac output and then move into talking a little bit about the blood vessels and things like that.